Today I would like to continue my series on world building, and the subject I would like to discuss today is scope. What is the scope of the world that you are trying to build? No matter the world you're trying to create, scope is going to be a hugely important thing to decide from the very start of creating the world that you're trying to build. Scope will help you decide where to hone in on and what details that you need to account for in the world that you're trying to build. The scope of the world you're trying to build can be anything from a room, such as in like Toy Story. It can be a building, such as The Shining. It can be a town, such as It's a Beautiful Life. It can be a city, like in Blade Runner. You could have it could be an entire world, such as in Avatar. It could be a universe, like in Star Trek or Star Wars or Mass Effect. The world that you're trying to create, or the scope of the world that you're trying to create, will really help you figure out what the details that you're going to need to come up with as the designer of this world. Now, keep in mind that having a big world or having a larger scope of the world that you're going to create does not necessarily mean that you need to create more things for that particular scope of a world. I would say, as a writer, if you're creating the scope of a room like Toy Story versus the scope of an entire universe like Star Wars, the amount of information you're going to need to come up with for the world of each of those scenarios is approximately the same. If there is a difference between them, that difference is small. As you create more characters, more objects, more locations, you want to create enough detail for all of those things to be believable and interesting. Having a smaller scope does not lessen the amount of work you have to do. In fact, the smaller your scope, the more detailed each of the things that are in your world need to be. Think about Toy Story and think about all of the detail that went into every aspect of that world, every character, every little detail in the room, and all of the other components, the objects, the setting, the individual locations within the room where various set pieces take place, like on the bed and in the windowsill. And you will see that these things aren't lacking in details. Even if you go on to the scope of Star Wars and you look at the various planets that are in the series, like Kashyyyk or Kamino or Hoth, all of those things have a certain amount of detail that really lends itself to the personality, the soul of that location or that setting. And that is something to keep in mind regardless of the scope of the story or the world that you're trying to build. A lot of writing mediums especially have said that you need to create this huge, vibrant amount of information, even if you're not going to use that information. But I think Brandon Sanderson said in one of his lectures that you don't need to create a ton of content. You need to make every bit of content you have meaningful and have a purpose. I plan on making a video in the future, Everything for a Purpose, and in that video I will go into more detail about creating every individual aspect of your world with purpose. But for now I'm going to continue talking about scope. So the scope of your story is going to help dictate what you need to do. If the world you're trying to build takes place in a single building over the course of the story you're telling, then you need to have every location and every individual, every object have weight in the story. If an object comes into play, that object has to have meaning. If a character goes into a room, you need to really see that that room is real and it's lived in. It's not sterile unless it's meant to be, and it really should serve the purpose of the part of the story that you want it to tell. So if your setting takes place in a single building and your characters, or your protagonist at least, ends up in, say, a library, that library needs to be interesting. It needs to be filled with books, and it needs to have places to sit, and it needs to have, potentially, for depending on your story, other characters that are interesting and would be there. You don't put the football star in a library and him not have a purpose there. You don't just put him there to tell the story necessarily. You want him to be there for some kind of reason. And you're more likely to find a bookwormy nerd kind of character or a librarian in this library room. You're going to need books that are not universal. You don't want to put a Bible in your story. If Christianity doesn't exist in your world, you don't put Shakespeare in your library. If Shakespeare hasn't existed in the history of your world, you want books that are relevant and make sense for the setting you're in. If your book takes place on Mercury, you want a book that's the history of Mercury by David Soloban. And you want to make every part of your story very important and very relevant, regardless of your scope. If your character travels to the planet Baklava, you want that planet to have a personality and a feeling, and you want it to be memorable, and you want it to be interesting, and you want it to drive the story forward. Just like if your character spends time on various planets, you want each of those planets to have just the amount of detail. Despite the scope of your story, you're like, that's going to be a lot of work. You don't need to come up with the entire culture, the entire history, the ruling body, the landmarks, the industries of every location you're in. You just need to have what is relevant for the story you're trying to tell based on the scope of your story. Scope is going to be an important barometer to where you go with the rest of your story. You don't want to go to a planet, describe every piece of geography across the entire planet, describe the history of each region on that planet, and have that planet only be a very small 10 pages, 10 minutes of the time that you're using, because you're going to overload the consumer with unnecessary information. I'd say some of the best examples of creating places and creating things within an appropriate scope are like George R.R. Martin. George R.R. Martin loves to write history. His books are like borderline history novels with fantastic elements. But everything you absorb in those stories is meaningful information. Whereas you could look at a number of other smaller scale YA novels and stuff, and you can be like, somebody can be describing this desk to you, and then you move on from the story, and then that desk never comes up. You're like, why did you explain that desk to me? In the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, you see a girl who draws pictures of the things in the environment. And though these plants and these animals might not have any direct bearing on the story, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but it's characterizing that character. She pays attention to things that aren't relevant to the main story because she's a character, and therefore, like, her paying attention to these things makes them relevant to the story. So keep in mind that the scope of your story, the bigger the scope, that doesn't mean you have to create more content. The bigger your scope means that all of the content that you do create has to be meaningful, and it has to be memorable, and it has to be interesting. Regardless of the scope of the story you're trying to create, keep those things in mind. Make it interesting, make it memorable, and make it relevant, because you don't want to put filler in your story for the sake of filler, because that is not good, and it doesn't do anything for your reader, it doesn't do anything for your story, and it might appeal to very detail-oriented people, but ultimately you're spending time doing these things when you could be spending time really fleshing out aspects of the world that are meaningful and important to the story you're trying to tell. I hope you enjoyed this video. I plan on continuing this series. I have a lot of ideas for the Everything with Meaning video, so I'm probably going to be looking into recording that one next. I'm going to be sharing some channels at the end of this that I've been watching and enjoying lately, and I'm going to really try to show off some of the stuff that's inspired me to write these videos or helps get me thinking, or rather, things that I can't do that other people have done well, like talk about movies or talk about the minutiae of video game making. And I really enjoyed some of these people's perspectives on those things, and they do it better than me. I am not perfect. I cannot tell all of the things. So I hope you come back to the channel sometime and go create something, and I will see you later.